Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is deployment options and data residency for finance and operations apps. My name is Tim, and I will be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this session through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. This session is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. When you join this event, your name, email address, and/or phone number may be viewable by other session participants in the attendee list. By joining, you're agreeing to this experience. The recording will be available on the TechTalk's Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for our presenters or need any support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions during the session and in a live Q&A if there's remaining time at the end of the presentation. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Tommy Skaue, Fast Track Senior R&D Solution Architect. Tommy, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good day, and good afternoon, depending on where you're watching this Tech Talk. My name is Tommy Skaue. I'm a Senior Solution Architect here at Fast Track for Dynamics 365. Along with me, I have my colleagues and co-presenters, Davy Vliegen and Olga Petrova, who will be monitoring the questions and answers while I'm presenting. Now, feel free to post your questions, and we will try to address them as best as we can. We might have a time available for a Q&A session at the end of this presentation. This Tech Talk is titled Deployment Options and Data Residency for Finance and Operations Apps. And in this presentation, we plan to share with you the high level of what deployment options are and where you can go to find more information as we continuously make new geographies and Azure regions available in the future. Here are the objectives of this Tech Talk so that you know what to expect. We first want to briefly explain some things about the Azure infrastructure, not too deep and too technical, but enough to help you understand what the basic components are. Building on top of this, we will share some key information you might want to further investigate when you decide what geography that you want to deploy in. We also want to show you where finance and operations apps can be deployed at the time of this presentation and what cloud options are available and how you can access these. We also want to briefly touch upon some limitations and considerations, but not without showing you where you can go to find the latest updated information. We also want to spend a few minutes at the end of the sharing what you need to consider if you believe you have to move from one geography to another. If you're looking for detailed steps on how to deploy environments, then you're not going to find them in this Tech Talk. Although I think most of you will be able to figure that out on your own after this presentation. Before we get into the details, I just want to land one important and basic principle with you. Here at Microsoft, we take very strong measures to help protect data from unauthorized access. So the data that the customers are creating is secured from inappropriate use. It is the customer that owns the data, and it is the customer that controls where the data should be located. It is the customer that makes this decision. Microsoft is offering multiple services across the world, and in a long list of locations, the customer is at the end of the day in the driving seat and controls where they store their data. So with this in hand, let's take a quick look at how we offer these locations around the world. First, I will show you a small demo of a neat way of browsing the global infrastructure that Microsoft has built to sustain all our cloud offerings. Okay, you should now be seeing a globe spinning around with some animations and some lines and dots and circles. This is the visualization of the Azure global infrastructure. You can find it on infrastructuremap.microsoft.com. And I'll be just showing you this just to help you better understand some of the terminologies and the words I will be using in this presentation. So the first thing I'll do, I'll head over here to the legend. I'm just going to turn off everything. And I'll start off by showing the different geographies. So turn that on, you'll see these white dots appear, and they all represent the different available geographies. So we have Africa, we have India, we have Australia. Yeah, and then if I turn on the regions, you'll see these light blue circles show up, and then you'll actually see within each geography where the data, where the regions are. So in Japan, you have these two regions. If I go over to Europe and have a look at United Kingdom, you have UK West and UK South. If I go to Brazil, you have Brazil South here, and so on and so forth. And in this presentation, I will be talking about geographies, and you can think of them as you have different countries like this, and then within each geography, you'll have these various regions. Great. So now that you've seen that we have all this infrastructure all around the world, let us go one level deeper, hopefully without this becoming too technical. Starting at the level of the Azure data centers, these are physical locations where the data center has its own independent networking, cooling, and power. And these are large buildings containing all of the hardware and infrastructure needed to have a reliable, high-quality data center. We organize these data centers in what we call availability zones. So there can be several data centers close together within the same availability zone. One more level up, we group several availability zones into what we call Azure region. A region will be a set of data centers all deployed within a latency-defined perimeter and connected through a dedicated region-low latency network. If you remember the light blue circles in that Azure global infrastructure, those are Azure regions. I didn't show it on the map, but in that same view, we also show regions that we have announced to come in the future. You also might remember the white dots on the map, which represents the geographies. Those are areas in the world that contains at least one Azure region. Geographies, they define discrete markets that preserve data residency and compliance boundaries. They allow customers with specific data residency and compliance needs to keep their data and applications close. Geographies are fault-tolerant to withstand a complete region failure through their connection to Azure dedicated high-capacity network infrastructure. So now you know the difference between the actual data centers, how they are organized into Azure availability zones, and how these form the Azure region. You also know how these Azure regions in turn form the data residency boundary we call geography, or geo for short. There are some other concepts I want to call out, which are good to know in relations to finance and operations apps. We utilize the region pairing to make our services reliable and protect against region-wide incidents. You can find the existing pairings on our docs, and you might also find that these region pairings are predefined and you cannot override them. We call this strategy cross-region or paired region. Having said that, finance and operations apps are considered regional service, meaning all the components and services run within a single region. In comparison to, for example, Azure DevOps or Azure Active Directory, those services are non-regional, meaning that these services will run typically across multiple regions, fully transparent to you as a user. One more final terminology that could be interesting to know is zonal service. Those are services that are ensured to run within an availability zone. This is something we completely manage to ensure the best available option for our product, as this provides even more stringent latency and performance. Put differently, we run finance and operations apps as zonal services to ensure the most optimal latency. So with some terminology in place, next I wanted to share some good locations for you to discover more information when you need it. The first one I want to call out is this white paper that covers data residency and data protection in Azure. This is not a Dynamics 365 specific white paper, but covers Azure in general. It is not that uncommon for Dynamics 365 implementations to include several different Azure cloud services, so taking a holistic view on this is strongly recommended. The white paper has information on how customers can control data residency and how Microsoft protects customers from unauthorized access and how Microsoft challenges government requests and other third-party orders. It also talks about how Microsoft approach compliancy with privacy regulations and standards for protecting the privacy of customer data. The second white paper I want to call out, it is the one that covers what Microsoft does to ensure resiliency for the services that we provide. This one is called Azure Resiliency, Business Continuity, and Disaster Recovery. It has information on what we do to maintain our strong service level agreement for uptime and the measures we take to meet business requirements for recover time objectives and recovery point objectives, mean time to recover, and mean time between failures. It is a really good document for customers planning to move their applications from on-premises to the cloud and wants to understand how resilience is designed into an Azure well architecture framework. Now, I have already mentioned in the Azure terminology section that Microsoft has some services that will be regional and some services that are non-regional services. This means we may copy the data used between regions inside the selected geography. One example is the geography of Europe, where data is copied between West Europe data center in Netherlands to North Europe data center in Ireland. I call that out specifically so you know about it and you can analyze on the data residency in Azure page how these services are using and storing their data. The page lets you select the various geographies so that you can understand their data residency boundaries, and it also shows you a list of the regional services and the non-regional services. One more thing before we start looking at lifecycle services for finance and operations apps. As you begin analyzing and assessing what data you need to protect in the cloud, you might want to consider if the data can be grouped into different protection classification. And this is important so that you do not pick the same protection strategy for all the data, but design it in a way that makes sense and has the correct scope. If you select the same strict and stringent protection classification for all the data, you might not be able to best utilize the services, and this can easily become an unnecessary blocker for your deployments in the cloud. Think about that. You will have some data you can store for general purposes and still be within compliance with applicable regulations. Then you might have some data that needs to have additional protection and additional level of security if it needs to be stored outside of these defined boundaries. And in some rare cases, there are very strict regulations on very specific kinds of data. I call them out here as sacred, but you can think of them as highly sensitive and as data that simply cannot leave the geography boundaries, not even the backup of this data. Consider carefully where you can safely deploy services and have the data stored while being compliant. And if needed, can any of that data that needs any special consideration be deployed differently and accessed differently? Okay, let's shift gear and have a look at Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations apps, which is the main reason you're watching this presentation, I assume. Before you can even deploy any finance and operations apps today, you will have to use Lifecycle services, or LCS for short. I will not go into the details of what LCS is and what can be done in LCS, but I want to spend some time on some of the key elements in LCS that you should keep in mind. There is more to LCS beyond these 4 elements listed here, but these 4 play a key role, and I will explain what I mean by that. First is the concept of projects. For production environments and pre-production sandbox environments, you need what is called an implementation project. It holds the production environment and the one standard acceptance test environment that comes with the product license. The first time a customer opens LCS and they have valid licensing, an implementation project gets created automatically through some very simple initial steps so that you don't have to think about that. However, it is good to know that there is an implementation project concept out there. This means that if the customer needs multiple production environments, they will need multiple implementation projects, one for each production environment. And that is assuming that they will need to run all of them on the same customer Azure AD tenant. Now, LCS currently lets customer have multiple implementation projects, but we expect the customer to be responsible for the governance and the management of these projects. You also need to add users to the projects, and these are normally users from the customer's own Azure AD, but also typically others from the extended implementation team, like, for example, the partner resources helping the customer with the implementation. The users are invited to the projects, and you can have different users in the different projects. Again, the customer is responsible for governing and managing what users are invited to the projects and what kind of access they have. I have already mentioned each implementation project comes with one production environment and one standard acceptance test environment. But you can also procure additional sandbox environments to sustain your implementation activities. If you have additional sandboxes, these will show up as available environment slots in the implementation project. And here I will call out the projects in plural because all the slots will show on all the projects. LCS currently has no capability to divide the add-ons between the multiple implementation projects. So it is the customer who is responsible for governing and managing the use of these add-on licenses and not violate the licensing by deploying more environments than they have purchased. Finally, I want to mention assets. In LCS, there are several work streams where you use assets. It could be package deployments of updates or customizations. It could be deployment assets related to your commerce customizations. It could be that you're doing some database exports and or imports. While you have project assets specific to a given project, you can also copy assets between projects by using the shared asset library. Now, taking into consideration what we have previously discussed about data residency, the files that you upload into LCS will be stored in the geography where LCS is running. Now, why am I calling this out? Well, it should become clearer as we get to the topic of multiple lifecycle services portals and endpoints. So what do we mean by lifecycle services portals and endpoints? Well, if you have been using LCS, you most likely navigated to lcs.dynamics.com and you operated on the projects from there. You could deploy environments and place them in many different geographies like United States, United Kingdom, India, Japan, Australia, and so on. We call this the global cloud, as it is and has been traditionally where you can deploy in all the available geographies and regions where finance and operations apps are available in our global Azure infrastructure. For those of you who have implemented Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations apps and have been using LCS Dynamics.com, you are using LCS hosted in the United States. This is and has worked fine for years as we make sure it runs around the sun to support all our customers around the world. However, some years back, we deployed additional LCS endpoints, which really are separate LCS instances running in other geographies. We divide these additional options into local cloud and sovereign cloud. Now, let me try to explain what I mean by this. Local cloud are LCS endpoints where we ensure all customer data is stored at rest within a specific geography. LCS will be using the worldwide public infrastructure to run, but the customer data at rest is stored in the geo of that LCS endpoint. So what is sovereign cloud then? Sovereign cloud is optimized to use infrastructure, networking, telemetry, compute, and all the customer data, all self-contained within the boundaries of a sovereign geo, with minimal to no reliance on worldwide infrastructure. Sovereign cloud also comes with more comprehensive personnel requirements and access limitations. Now, if we start looking at the local cloud, what do we have? We have at the time of the recording available one LCS endpoint in EU, more specifically running out of West and North Europe Azure regions. What is special about this is that it has its Azure regions in 2 different countries, although both are part of the European Union. There is France, which was announced back in October 2019. Then there is United Arab Emirates, or UAE, and South Africa, which was made available a little bit later. There is Switzerland, which was made available not that long ago. And recently, also Norway was added to the list. One of the sovereign cloud offerings, on the sovereign cloud offerings, we have 2 available. One is the US Government Community Cloud, and the second one is one run by 21 Vianet operating in China. As explained, these are especially isolated and restricted, and deploying in these has very strong security measures. These offerings are the ones current at the time of this presentation, but we have more options planned. If you want to know the latest, you should visit the docs articles where more information about these cloud options are shared. The link is on the slide, and we are constantly updating the docs articles to provide updated and accurate information. Okay, so let's have a look at the map to see where these are located. So I took the Azure Global Infrastructure map and shifted it into a 2-dimensional mode. I kept the Azure regions on the map that I wanted to bring into the presentation. You'll also see that I colorized them a bit to separate them slightly. You see a mix of white and gray dots. These are Azure regions that either was available in the past or has been planned. Let's just disregard them for now. The light blue dots are the usual regions where you can deploy finance and operation apps environments. You see regions in Americas, North and South. You have EMEA covering Europe and UK. There is India, and further east we have Asia Pacific, Japan, and Australia. Now, these are Azure regions available when you deploy Microsoft Managed Sandbox and production environments when using the global LCS endpoint. You might have noticed in Europe, I've colored West and North Europe differently. This is because these 2 Azure regions are available in both the global LCS endpoint and the EU LCS endpoint. Historically, the EU LCS endpoint was not available, but we have several customers today with their environments deployed in these Azure regions. Although they manage their implementation projects still in the global LCS endpoint. What about the yellow dots? Now these are showing some of the local LCS endpoints, like mentioned in the previous slide. So you see France, UAE, South Africa, Switzerland, and Norway. I also included some green dots in the region of China, which are the ones managed by 21 Vinet for the sovereign cloud in China. So next, let's have a look at how you can access these endpoints. The first one is the one that most customers are using today, which is the global LCS endpoint. Although customers can deploy in multiple different Azure regions from this endpoint, the endpoint is running out of Azure regions in the United States. This global LCS endpoint will let you deploy it in EU Azure regions like North and West Europe. But to have all the LCS data stored in EU, you would have to use the EU LCS endpoint. The EU LCS endpoint is hosted in Ireland and Netherlands and is thus within the geography boundaries of EU. Then we have the LCS endpoint in France. We have the LCS endpoint in United Arab Emirates. And we have the one in South Africa. And then we have the one in my own backyard, Norway. We also have the sovereign cloud option in China, again, hosted and managed through 21 Vinet. And then finally, we have the government commercial cloud in discrete Azure regions in United States. You notice that each of them have their own URL, and behind each URL, there is, again, its own instance of LCS, like explained, with the customer data residing at rest within each of the geo boundaries. Let me call out something important. Even though these endpoints are there, we have additional endpoints planned, and we might slowly introduce them through something we call allow listing. What this means is that we might prevent you from creating implementation projects or accessing them on a LCS endpoint. If you need to deploy on an LCS endpoint that is behind this kind of restriction, you will have to reach out to Microsoft support and verify that you can be allowed access. And this access will be per Azure AD tenant. And this restriction might also then prevent partner resources from accessing if they are trying to open that LCS endpoint using their own Azure AD user from their own partner tenant. Now, it's not just the URL for the LCS endpoint itself, but this is important also for the other URLs. Just for comparison with customer engagement and Dataverse environments, these will also have some differences in the endpoint URL depending on deployment geography. You might have noticed in the Dataverse environment URL, there is CRM and a number. So for example, CRM3 is Canada, CRM4 is Europe, CRM6 is Australia, and so on. The complete list of these Dataverse URLs is not in scope for this presentation, but you'll notice that the finance and operation apps environments will have similar properties. It is a good design practice to separate these things into appropriate subdomains to better organize the network trafficking. Here I'm showing the typical pattern you will see, as there are a long list of endpoint URLs in the Dynamics 365 finance and operations apps realm. For global and local LCS endpoints, the main part will remain dynamics.com, but for the local endpoints, you will find the extra subdomain. For sovereign cloud, the main part of the URL is different, as you can see. As an example, for France, you can see the FR part of the URL for both production environment and the sandbox. And this remains true for all other endpoint URLs like the cloud-hosted environments, the Cloud POS endpoints, just as a couple of examples. Like shown in the presentation, production environment deployed in Norway will have the form of the unique environment name .operation.no.dynamics.com, and the sandbox deployed in EU will have the environment name .sandbox.operations.eu.dynamics.com. In addition, I also want to call out that if you are using the LCS API for any of your application lifecycle management pipelines or for any automated database management operations, you will have to adjust the endpoint URL in your scripts. And this will remain consistent with whatever LCS endpoint you are connecting to with your pipelines. Okay, so now with all of the information shared so far, how can you use all of this to your benefit? Maybe you are in the process of implementing in the cloud new, and you want to understand what geography and lifecycle services endpoints you should go for. You might already be in the cloud with an existing implementation, and you're considering if you need to relocate to a different geo, or perhaps even a different LCS endpoint. In the next segment, I will be presenting some of your options. But before we talk about movement options, we should spend some time on why you should pick one geo over the other. You might think the first thing to consider is purely technical. This is, after all, software running in the cloud, so the answer surely must be about the architectural limitations and concerns. Actually, in fact, the first pivot for selecting geography needs to be the compliance considerations. The industries are meeting new and challenging requirements as they relate to data residency and security compliance. And it is the customer's responsibility to ensure that they take these into account and make valid choices for where they store their data. What you need to investigate is whether your data is under any regulatory requirements imposed within your region and geography. It could be local to your country or to the collection of countries and regions near your place of operation. In fact, you might have a global spanning company operating in more than a single region and be subject to several different regional regulatory requirements. Some requirements concern special kinds of industries, like in the financial or insurance industry, or in the weapons manufacturing industry, or in healthcare, just as some examples. While these are more common, there are also some few customers who also need to consider requirements that force them to select sovereign cloud options. As previously mentioned, sovereign cloud has its own more comprehensive personal requirements and access limitations. For example, having dedicated monitored escort services for anyone who needs to access any service or data while supporting the customer. Microsoft provides different compliance offerings to meet regulatory requirements. We would recommend that you visit our Trust Center, and from there, you will find various documents discussing the standards and the compliance offers which Microsoft has. In some cases, Microsoft Marketing also assists in pointing customers to the information we have available there. From Fast Track, we would normally do the same and guide you to the Trust Center. After considering the compliance requirements, you can pivot into the next level of the investigation. I call this the platform and product capabilities. In here, you need to consider the fact that between the deployment options, there is not a fully 100% parity in terms of what is available of features and capabilities. Although we aim to ensure that the capabilities added lands across our global infrastructure, there normally are some capabilities that are not available everywhere for various reasons. As we innovate on the platform and on our products, we sometimes launch capabilities that gets deployed in some areas before others. Those of you with implementation experience within the last couple of years know that we have several services and add-ins to the finance and operation apps which are meant to improve and enhance the product. If you are unsure if a specific capability is available in a specific geography, or through a specific deployment option, you can visit the availability reports and visit our public-facing documentation. If you, for whatever reason, believes that this material is not timely accurate, which would be us really not making sure it's up to date, then you can reach out to Microsoft support and ask if the capability you are looking for is available, as you're really not seeing it mentioned in our documentation. For newly launched and announced geographies, this can particularly be the case. So ensure you investigate this carefully before simply assuming that there's going to be complete and full parity on the platform and the product everywhere. You can also work with your fast-track solution architect if you are engaged with us on your implementation project. And we can connect you with the product group to understand if the public-facing material is updated. The next thing in the list is regional implementations. As we launch new geos, some of them might have differences in how we offer business continuity and disaster recovery. And here I would refer back to the Azure Resilience white paper presented earlier for more details on how we secure uptime and availability within the Azure regions. There is also the question of capacity. If you are one of our customers implementing Dynamics 365 for commerce and want to deploy the cloud scaling unit, we have today shared some considerations on docs for what regions there is limited capacity. Now, this is just an example of how availability constraints can be regional. Thirdly, if you are taking dependencies on roadmap features, these might be constrained by what geography you're aiming for. On the other hand, the roadmap could inform you about capabilities we are making available in geos where they are currently not available today. On the availability reports, we try to project upcoming changes. I will still add a word of warning here, and that is to be cautious about those plans. They might be impacted by unforeseen events, and the announced roadmap events might have to be replanned. We typically recommend having a plan for that in case the roadmap does not pan out as expected. Finally, there is the LCS itself, having differences in features. You will want to take this into consideration as it might add some additional extra steps and work in your end. There are, for example, globally shared assets which currently only are available in the global LCS endpoint and not in the local LCS endpoint. Now, if you need these project assets in your workstream, you will have to manually download them from global LCS and upload them to the local LCS in any respective projects. There is also not the same availability of the published business process libraries across the LCS endpoints. Also, on-premises deployments from LCS is not supported. And these are just some examples of things that behave differently on these LCS endpoints. And going forward, we plan to publish a more comprehensive list of what is available where. Finally, I want to add a couple of additional considerations. The first one here is the actual proximity of the target geo from your local operations and where your users will connect to the services. I've deliberately put this somewhere down on the list of things to consider. Normally, using Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations apps, you can have a latency up to a couple of 100 milliseconds and still have the UI loaded within acceptable loading time. However, there are some client experiences, for example, handheld devices or some other interfaces, which are more latency sensitive, and having a low latency has real practical consequences. Now, we would suggest that you make this decision based on initial analysis and testing. For customers who operate on a global scale, they would need to carefully consider if they can operate through a single production instance and still have satisfactory latency and end user experience. However, for customers who operate in a single geo, they have the option to pick perhaps from several GLs where the distance and latency has no real practical consequences. The second here is licensing. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is because there are some deployment options which have specific licensing requirements. These would be sovereign cloud offerings. If you need to deploy in any of these, you should verify with Microsoft Marketing what the appropriate SKUs are so that you do not invest in incorrect licensing. This is also something you need to consider if you find that you might have to move to a different geo or deployment option. And that leads me to the final point that I want to touch in this tech talk. And it is the natural question you might have at this point. What are the options to relocate and move around? Can you move around between the GLs? Can you move around between the LCS endpoints? Will it work? Is it safe? And what are the options? At the time of this presentation, there are some options, but we are working on adding more capabilities here to make it easier to move. I can't make any promises as to when these future improvements will be launched and how they will work. However, I will be spending some time talking about what can be done at this point in time. Depending on your scenario, movement can be a complex process. And for any questions around improvements for movements between LCS endpoints, I will be referring to our official documentation and Microsoft support. Now, we do also have plans to run future tech talks on this specific subject. Having said that, let us briefly look at some of the options that are available. It's still possible that they might be applicable for your scenario. The first example is the simplest one, where you have a sandbox deployed in your implementation project and you deployed it in the wrong geo or the wrong region, and you find that you need to move it. For example, you deployed in a region of West Europe, but you should have deployed in any of the regions in the Australia geo. Or you deployed in a region of United States geo, but you need to deploy in a geo closer to Europe. This obviously assumes that you're in an LCS endpoint that lets you actually pick these Azure regions while deploying the environments. If you have multiple sandbox environment slots on your project, you can deploy a new environment in the correct target region, install the exact same application version and customizations as already installed in the source. Then you can do a self-service database refresh operation from source to target. One thing to notice here is that the source and the target URL cannot be the same. You cannot have two environments running at the same time with the exact same URL for obvious reasons. If you do not have multiple sandbox environment slots or really not any slots available, your options are to export the source database to the asset library, then delete the source environment completely, deploy it again in the correct target region, then apply the correct application with any customizations, and finally import the database from the asset library. Now, there are several concerns that apply here. Through these kinds of database copy operations, there is loss of data, and this might have to be recreated somehow. The details of what data that gets lost within each operation is already available on docs. And in here, not only am I talking about the data in the database, but also any cloud storage attachments. Again, storage is not included in such a move. Additionally, depending on the size of the source database, exporting to the asset library might be limited in terms of the size of the backpack file. What about moving production environments? This one is a bit more difficult, especially if the production environment that is already established has existing complexity and having integrations and dependencies. This requires more planning and tough decisions. We call it out on docs that we can help move an existing production environment through Microsoft support, but it is a rare scenario. The entire process is not fully automated and requires involvement by support engineers. Here we do have the option here to copy over the cloud storage attachments as part of the process. In any case, the expectation here is that you've already moved pre-production sandboxes to the target region and you've done end-to-end testing in the target region to ensure that you will not be blocked by anything after moving production. You also need a plan for a cutover, and you should plan this with Microsoft support well ahead of time. If you file a support request late on a Friday afternoon, expecting a move to happen that exact same weekend, we are not going to be able to quickly turn around and make that happen. Instead, you should have a good and clear plan of all of the steps, who does what and when. Now, if you're not live yet, there might still be time to reconsider the target geo and the deployment options, and that not having any significant impact and threat to your timeline and plans. However, if you are already live in production, this can simply be just more complicated and involved. Just to mention some important considerations. You obviously have the risk of data which might have to be recreated. This can in some cases be environment-specific information which needs to be recreated anyway, but it can also be data related to encrypted information, connections to BYOD, Azure Data Lake, linking to Power Platform and Dataverse, connections to commerce components, and so on and so forth. You might have integrations established and have middleware endpoints configured. If you consider the fact of a possible change of the URL between source and target, this would clearly break endpoint dependencies and it will need to be reconfigured. You will have to plan out all the steps the customer or partner needs to take ahead of the move, along with any steps after the move. If this is a move that involves Microsoft support, like the move of a production environment, then that also needs to be planned and agreed with Microsoft. Admittedly, movement of a production environment is a rare thing, as customers typically deploy in a carefully selected target region. Finally, and perhaps most importantly at this point, is that right now we do not support movement between LCS endpoints. So if you need to move between cloud options like global to local or sovereign cloud or vice versa, there is no current support for this. Now, we acknowledge there are customers who are already looking towards moving from global LCS to local LCS, and we are working on making this better in the future and enabling this. If you're already now in an urgent need to move your existing production environment to a different LCS endpoint, you will have to reach out to Microsoft support to understand the timeline. And with that, I will end the presentation with some final callouts of links to resources that are related to this topic. I have added some contextual links to each of the slides so that when we publish this on our community side, you can download the presentation and find the relevant links and content. So this is a good time to look at any of the questions from the audience to see if there's anyone that we want to include in the presentation. Do you have anyone you want to call out specifically, Davy?
Thank you, Tommy. I think in general, most questions were more answered on a one-on-one basis. I mean, some of the questions that popped up were also, I think, answered later on in the presentation. So questions about can you move projects from one LCS endpoint to another? I think that just has been discussed. Also questions regarding when you should go to choose for multiple production environments versus a single one. Although that was not the subject of this tech talk, I think Tommy also explained some of the reasons and considerations you have to make when you choose the main location and of your production environment, correct? And then there were also questions related to LCS residency, LCS endpoint, as it has an effect on geography or locations of the actual deployment, which I think also has been explained in this tech talk. So it is important. It's not that from each LCS endpoint today you can deploy to each geography, and for some of it you will never will because of the difference between global, local, and sovereign cloud, which also has been explained in this tech talk. And then the last one I want to call out is that, of course, there is some feedback regarding missing administration or monitoring tools in LCS, and I think we are fully aware of that, and the product group, the PM, are fully aware of limitations today. That feedback is all well taken, but we also, as we plan to move to the Power Platform Admin Center in the future, some of them are now in the backlog to light up once we move to Power Platform Admin Center. So I think that's a summary of the questions that I wanted to call out, Tommy.
Perfect. Thanks, David. Well, I just then want to finally plug the implementation guide. If you haven't already checked it out, I could draw your attention to the environment strategy guide in chapter 9, and in chapter 12 we talk about security, and some of the topics in this presentation are also in there. It's about data residency and the considerations around those. And yeah, if there's nothing else, I just want to thank everybody for attending the Tech Talk, and I wish you a wonderful day ahead. And I'm going to hand back over to you, Tim, for closing the presentation.
Thank you, Tommy. I've posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's session and to hear what you'd like to see in future events. Thank you for your participation. As a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenter and to our Q&A admins and to our audience for joining us today. Have a great rest of the day ahead.